I remember the first time I looked into a mirror and saw nothing looking back. Not darkness, not absence, just the wall behind me, perfectly visible, as though I'd become transparent to my own gaze. The Medicae orderly who found me standing there, staring at that empty silver rectangle in the sanitation chamber, told me I'd been screaming. I have no memory of sound leaving my throat. That was 3 months into my service aboard the Eternal Clemency, a prisoner transport vessel carrying 14,000 souls from the hive cities of Mordian to the penal mining colonies of Gehenna Tertius. I was a junior scribe in the administratum detail, one of 40 clerks responsible for maintaining the manifests, ration calculations, and mortality documentation required by Imperial law. Before that morning in the sanitation chamber, I'd believed myself fortunate. The work was tedious but clean. The quarters were cramped but private. I had access to real recaf, not the synthetic paste served to the prisoner blocks. I told myself I was performing the Emperor's work, that every tally mark in my ledger served the Imperium's grand design. The mirror incident should have been my first warning. Instead, I dismissed it as exhaustion, the product of too many shifts beneath the flickering lumen strips, too many hours reviewing endless columns of identification numbers and death dates. The ship's Medicae gave me a mild sedative and sent me back to my quarters with instructions to rest. I took the pills. I slept poorly. When I returned to my station the following morning, I told no one what I'd seen, or rather, what I hadn't seen. The archives where I worked occupied a narrow compartment deep in the vessel's administrative section, 3 decks above the prisoner holds and 2 below the officers' quarters. The air tasted of parchment and machine oil, a combination I'd once found comforting. My desk sat in the 4th row, surrounded by filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, each drawer containing the physical records that our cogitator systems cross-referenced. The administratum believes in redundancy. Every prisoner had both a digital entry and a paper file. Every death required both an electronic notation and a signed mortality certificate. The system was inefficient, archaic, and absolutely inviolable. I'd spent my first weeks aboard learning the rhythms of the work. Morning shift began with updates from the night watch, new deaths in the holds, typically between 5 and 12 per 8-hour period. Disease, mostly. Sometimes violence. Occasionally the guards would mark a death as complications during discipline, which meant anything from a beating gone too far to summary execution for infractions I was not authorized to question. My job was simply to record. Prisoner 34,782 deceased. 3rd hour of the night shift. Cause listed as respiratory failure. Prisoner 45,293 deceased. 7th hour, blunt force trauma during restraint. The numbers accumulated. The files grew thicker. 3 other scribes worked my section. Caius, a gaunt man in his 50s who'd served on prison transports for 2 decades, rarely spoke except to correct errors in filing procedure. Mara had transferred from census work on a forge world and possessed an unsettling ability to recite prisoner numbers from memory. The third was Hendrik, youngest of us, still possessed of the rigid idealism that the Schola Administratum instilled in its graduates. He believed every mark in our ledgers mattered, that our meticulous documentation served some higher purpose in the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery. I'd believed something similar when I'd first received my assignment. The day after the mirror, I noticed the first prisoner without a reflection. We were required to process identity confirmations every 3rd day, a procedure designed to prevent errors in the death records. Guards would bring prisoners in groups of 10 to a verification chamber adjacent to our archives. We would confirm their identification numbers matched their physical appearance, check for obvious signs of mutation or disease, and return them to the holds. The process was mechanical, numbing in its repetition. Prisoner approaches. Guard states number. I check manifest. I look at prisoner. I confirm or deny match. Next prisoner. The woman they brought in during the morning verification was unremarkable in every way that mattered to my documentation. Prisoner 67,234 Age approximately 35. No visible mutations. Scarification on left forearm consistent with hive gang markings. Sentenced to 15 years labor for unauthorized trade in prescribed materials. I had her file open on my desk, her image captured by PIC scanner during initial processing, her crimes and sentence duration all properly recorded. But when I looked up from the manifest to confirm her identity, I saw her face with perfect clarity, and yet the polished metal wall behind her reflected only the guard who'd escorted her in. She stood there, solid and real before me, breathing, blinking, her eyes meeting mine with the dull resignation common to all the prisoners. But the wall showed no sign of her presence. I blinked. I checked the manifest again. I looked at her. I looked at the wall. The reflection remained absent. Confirmation? The guard asked, impatient. I should have reported the discrepancy. I should have called for additional verification, requested a Medicaid evaluation, filed an incident report for anomalous phenomena. Instead, I heard myself say, confirmed. Identity matches. Returned to hold. The guard led her away. I watched until they passed through the security door, and throughout the entire transit, that polished metal wall showed only the guard's reflection, moving steadily down the corridor with empty space beside him. I told myself it was the lighting. Some trick of the lumen strips, a malfunction in the wall's reflective coating. My own exhaustion manifesting as perceptual error. I completed the morning's verifications without incident. 30 more prisoners, all with proper reflections, all properly documented. At midday I took my ration in the scribe's mess, ate without tasting, and returned to my desk for the afternoon shift. That night, alone in my quarters, I stood before my personal mirror for 20 minutes. My reflection stared back, pale and tired but undeniably present. I moved my hand. The reflection moved. I stepped closer. It stepped closer. Everything functioned as it should. I slept fitfully, dreaming of empty corridors and walls that showed only what they chose to show. The pattern emerged slowly, so gradually I almost convinced myself it was coincidence. Another prisoner without a reflection the following week during verification. Then 3 in a single session. Then 5. Always different prisoners. No common factors I could identify in their files. Different ages, different crimes, different sentences, different points of origin. Some were repeat offenders, others first-time criminals. Some had been aboard since departure from Mordian. Others had been loaded at waypoint stations along our route. The only consistency was the absence itself. They stood solid and real before me, breathing and bleeding and undeniably physical, while the walls behind them remained empty of their images. I began keeping a separate ledger, hidden in my personal quarters, documenting every instance, prisoner numbers, verification dates, any distinguishing characteristics. I told myself I was being thorough, that if this was some administrative error or technical malfunction, my private records would help identify the cause. But I knew better. I was documenting something the official systems were not designed to see, something that existed in the gap between what was recorded and what was real. Caius noticed me staring at the walls during a verification session. "Problem with the files?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of suspicion that long service in the administratum cultivates. "Just confirming the manifest matches," I said, keeping my eyes on the prisoner before me, a man whose reflection showed perfectly normal in the metal wall, whose image aligned precisely with the picked capture in his file. "You've been confirming very carefully lately," Caius observed, "making sure we maintain our accuracy standards." "The Emperor's work demands precision," I replied, speaking the rote phrase we'd all learned in training. He studied me for a long moment before returning to his own station. I felt his attention on me for the rest of the shift, a weight I couldn't shake. That evening, I went to the ship's chapel during meditation hour. I'm not a particularly faithful man. My devotion to the Emperor had always been more administrative than spiritual, a matter of proper forms and correct observances rather than genuine belief. But the chapel was one of the few spaces aboard the Time's eternal clemency times that felt separate from the endless documentation, the constant tallying of prisoners and deaths and resources. The shipboard priest was a severe woman named Confessor Yelena, her face marked with ritual scars that spelled out passages from the Lectitio Divinitatis in High Gothic. She knelt before the Emperor's icon, her lips moving in silent prayer. I stood at the back of the chapel, uncertain what I'd come seeking. "You carry questions," she said without turning, her voice echoing in the vaulted space. "I can hear them in your breathing." I approached slowly, genuflecting before the icon out of habit rather than conviction. "Confessor, what does it mean when something exists but leaves no mark? When a person is present but creates no evidence of their presence?" She turned to face me, her scarred features unreadable in the candlelight. "Are you asking about souls, scribe? About those who live but leave no impression upon the Imperium? Or are you asking about something more immediate?" "I don't know what I'm asking," I admitted. "The Imperium is built on records," Yelena said, rising to her feet with the careful movements of someone whose joints ached from too many years kneeling on cold metal. "We document everything. We preserve every name, every number, every death. We do this because we believe that to be recorded is to matter. That to exist in the archives is to exist in the Emperor's sight, and those who exist but aren't recorded." Her expression shifted, something almost like pity crossing her scarred face. "Come with me, scribe. There's something you should see." She led me through the chapel's rear door into a narrow corridor I hadn't known existed, down a spiral stair that descended far below the administrative decks. The air grew colder as we moved deeper, the taste changing from parchment and oil to something older, more organic. The metal walls gave way to bare rock in places, as though the ship had been built around something that predated its construction. We emerged into a chamber I can only describe as a ossuary, though that word fails to capture the scale of what I witnessed. The walls were lined with niches, thousands upon thousands of them, each containing a skull. Not human skulls, these were too large, too angular, their eye sockets positioned wrong for any anatomy I recognized. And covering every surface, carved into the bone itself, were names, not numbers. Names. "The ship's true manifest," Yelena said quietly. "The prisoners who came before the administratum, before the proper documentation, when this vessel served a different purpose." I stared at the skulls, at the endless names carved in scripts I couldn't read. "How long has this ship been in service?" "Longer than the Imperium has records for. It was reclaimed, repurposed, given new designation and new purpose. But some things persist, some patterns repeat." She touched one of the skulls gently, almost reverently. "Tell me, scribe, when you look at these, do you see their reflections in the walls?" I turned to check the metal surfaces of the chamber. The niches reflected perfectly. The skulls themselves showed clearly. But when I looked more carefully, I realized that the carved names, the names themselves, cast no reflection. The bone was visible. The eye sockets and teeth and structural features all reflected normally. But where names had been carved, the reflections showed only smooth, unmarked surface. "What does it mean?" I whispered. "It means," Yelena said, her voice hard, "that some things are meant to be forgotten. That the Imperium's great machine of documentation and control runs on a fuel it cannot acknowledge. Every prisoner transport, every penal ship, every vessel that carries the condemned, they all share this. We record what we're meant to record. We document what serves the system. But the real work, the true purpose, exists in the spaces between our numbers." I thought of my hidden ledger, of the prisoners without reflections, of the woman who'd stood solid before me while the wall showed empty space. "The ones without reflections, what happens to them?" "They serve," she said simply. "They fulfill the ship's true purpose. The documentation you maintain, the files and manifests and death certificates, those are for the administratum, for the official records. But the ship itself requires different fuel. It always has." "I don't understand." Yelena turned to face me fully, and in the dim light of the ossuary, I saw that her reflection in the metal wall showed her face as it must have been before the ritual scarring, younger, unscarred, with different eyes. The disconnect between her physical presence and her reflected image was so profound, I felt my stomach lurch. "You will," she said, "continue your work, scribe. Maintain your documentation. The Emperor's bureaucracy must function. But know that you serve two masters now, the one who requires paperwork and the one who requires sacrifice. The ones who lose their reflections are simply those the ship has chosen. It's been choosing since before your grandfather was born." She left me there among the skulls and their unreadable names, ascending the spiral stair with slow, deliberate steps. I remained in the ossuary for perhaps an hour, examining the niches, trying to understand the pattern. But there was no pattern I could recognize, no logic to which skulls bore names and which remained blank, no system that connected the carved scripts to anything in my training. When I finally returned to my quarters, I found my hidden ledger lying open on my desk, though I was certain I'd locked it in my storage compartment. Someone had added an entry in handwriting I didn't recognize, prisoner 67,234F, the first reflectionless woman I'd documented, now marked with a notation, asterisk, transferred to auxiliary services. No further documentation required, asterisk. I checked the official manifest on my cogitator terminal. Prisoner 67,234F was listed as deceased. Cause of death recorded as sudden cardiac failure. Time of death marked as occurring 2 days after her verification session with me, but I knew she hadn't died. I'd seen her in the auxiliary corridor just that afternoon, her reflection still absent, her physical presence undeniable. The discrepancy between official record and observed reality should have troubled me more than it did, but I was beginning to understand that the Time's eternal clemency times operated on multiple levels of truth, that my documentation served one function while the ship itself pursued another. I began observing more carefully during verification sessions, noting not just which prisoners lacked reflections, but how the guards treated them differently. The reflected prisoners received the standard rough handling shoves, harsh commands, the casual violence that characterized all prisoner interactions. But the reflectionless ones were moved, with something approaching caution. The guards avoided direct contact when possible, used longer restraint poles, maintained greater distance, as though they knew these prisoners had already been marked for different purposes. Mara caught me watching during a particularly crowded verification session. "You notice things," she said quietly, keeping her voice below the level the guards might overhear. "The ones who don't show up properly in the reflections." I froze, uncertain whether to deny or confirm. "It's all right," she continued, her eyes never leaving her own manifest. "We all notice eventually. Some of us just choose to keep documenting according to protocol. The system works better when we don't ask questions about discrepancies." "How long have you known?" "Since my second week aboard. I transferred from census work on Griffon the 4th. Do you know what we documented there?" She finally looked at me, her expression carefully neutral. "Population numbers for a hive city that officially contained 40 million inhabitants, but the utility consumption, the water reclamation, the food distribution, all the physical infrastructure suggested a population at least 3 times that size. When I filed reports about the discrepancy, my supervisor explained that some citizens simply don't appear in official records, that the Imperium requires both documented populations and undocumented labor, that my job was to maintain the numbers we were given, not to question what the numbers omitted. And you just accepted that?" "I accepted that the Imperium is vast, and I am small, and that my function is to scribe what I'm told to scribe. The same is true here. We document the prisoners according to official protocol. What the ship does with those who fall outside our documentation is not our concern." She returned to her manifest, her stylus moving with practiced precision across the parchment. "You'd do well to adopt the same perspective. The ones who question too deeply tend to develop complications. I thought of the confessor's scarred face and its unscarred reflection, of the ossuary full of skulls bearing names no one could read. What kind of complications? But Mara had already returned to her work, and the guard was bringing in the next group for verification. The following week, Hendrik disappeared. He'd been scheduled for the morning shift, but never arrived at his station. His absence was noted in the duty log, marked initially as unauthorized absence. When he failed to appear for second shift, Caius filed a formal report with the ship's administrative officer. A search was conducted, or so we were told. 3 days later, we received notification that Hendrik had been transferred to different duties aboard the vessel, location unspecified, further inquiries discouraged. His desk remained empty for a day before a new scribe arrived, a nervous young woman named Petra, who'd transferred from cargo documentation. She took Hendrik's seat, received his files, and began processing manifests with the mechanical efficiency the administratum prized. No one mentioned Hendrik's name again, in official capacity, but I saw him 4 days after his supposed transfer. I'd been working a late shift, processing a backlog of death certificates that had accumulated during a particularly virulent outbreak of flux in the lower holds. The work was grim, even by our standards, recording the deaths of children primarily, their small bodies unable to withstand the disease's progression. I was tired, my eyes burning from the lumen strips, my hand cramping from hours of careful documentation. I decided to walk to the observation deck before returning to my quarters, hoping that a glimpse of stars might clear my mind. The route took me past one of the auxiliary service corridors, a narrow passage that connected the administrative sections to the environmental control systems. Hendrik stood in that corridor, wearing a maintenance coverall rather than his administratum robes. He was adjusting something on an exposed pipe, his movements methodical but oddly disconnected, as though he was performing actions he'd memorized rather than understood. His reflection in the corridor's metal wall showed empty space, just the pipe and the wall behind him, but no trace of his physical form. "Hendrik," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence at all, simply continued his mechanical adjustments, his hands moving with precision that seemed wrong somehow, too perfect, too measured. I approached closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. My hand met solid flesh beneath the coverall, warmth indicating living tissue, the slight movement of breathing evident in the rise and fall of his back. "Hendrik, it's me. Are you all right? What happened? Why did they transfer you?" He turned then, and I wish I could say his eyes were empty or that some obvious sign of alteration marked his features. But he looked entirely like himself, same narrow face, same serious expression, same small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd once mentioned. Entirely normal except for the fact that the wall behind him reflected only corridor and pipe. "I'm performing my assigned duties," he said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly measured. "Maintenance requires attention. The ship requires service. What did they do to you? Where have you been?" "I've been serving," he replied, returning to his pipe adjustments. "As we all serve. The Emperor's work takes many forms. Documentation is one form. Maintenance is another. Both are necessary. Both are holy." I grabbed his arm, forcing him to face me again. "Hendrik, listen to me. You're a scribe. You work in archives. You were investigating something, weren't you? You found something in the records that troubled you." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, some brief spark of the man I'd known, the idealistic young administrator who'd believed every number mattered. "I found discrepancies," he said slowly, as though the words were being pulled from deep water. "Patterns in the death records, prisoners who were documented as deceased but whose resource allocations continued. Ration distributions for population numbers that decreased in official records but increased in actual consumption. The numbers didn't balance. I reported this. I filed proper documentation of the errors. And then what happened? And then I understood," he said, that spark fading from his eyes like a candle guttering out. "I understood that balance requires sacrifice, that the ship needs fuel, That some numbers cannot be recorded in the manifests because the manifests serve different purposes than the ship itself. I understand now. I serve better now. He pulled away from my grip with surprising strength, returning to his pipe adjustments. I stood there watching him work. This man who'd been my colleague, who'd believed in the sacred importance of proper documentation, now reduced to some kind of mindless maintenance automaton. Hendrik, come with me. We'll file a report. We'll contact the ship's administrative officer. This isn't right. This isn't how the Imperium operates. He laughed then, a sound entirely devoid of humor. This is exactly how the Imperium operates. This is the machinery beneath the machinery, the real work that enables the documented work. Go back to your archives, scribe. Maintain your manifests. Let the system function as it was designed to function. Some parts operate in light. Some parts operate in darkness. Both are necessary. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, summoned by what alarm I couldn't identify. Scribe, you're out of your authorized section. Return to quarters immediately. I wanted to argue, to demand explanations, to insist on proper procedures being followed, but the guard's hand rested on his shock maul, and Hendrik had already returned to his mechanical adjustments, and I understood with sudden clarity that I stood at a threshold. I could cross it, could push further, demand answers, refuse to accept the discrepancies, and risk becoming like Hendrik, losing my reflection and my documented existence. Or I could retreat to my authorized section, return to my manifests and death certificates, continue serving the function I'd been assigned. I chose retreat. I returned to my quarters, locked the door, and spent the night staring at my hidden ledger. The entries had grown extensive, dozens of prisoners now documented as reflectionless, their official records marked with deaths or transfers while I'd witnessed them moving through the ship's auxiliary corridors, performing tasks that served purposes I couldn't name. The pattern Hendrik had mentioned, the resource consumption that exceeded official population counts, made terrible sense. The ship carried 14,000 documented prisoners, but how many undocumented ones labored in the darkness, maintaining systems, performing services that enabled the Time's eternal clemency times to function? How many had lost their reflections, lost their recorded existence, been absorbed into the vessel's true machinery? I thought about Confessor Yelena's words, about the ship's age and its previous purposes. What had the Time's eternal clemency times been before the Administratum repurposed it as a prisoner transport? What patterns had been carved into its structure during those earlier incarnations, and why did it require this specific fuel living beings stripped of their documented existence, relegated to auxiliary service, in spaces between the official functions? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of corridors that extended forever, of walls that reflected some people but not others, of ledgers that filled themselves with entries I couldn't read. I woke to find another addition to my hidden documentation, this time a chart, professionally drafted, showing the layout of the Time's eternal clemency's Time's lower decks. Sections I'd never seen on official schematics were marked in red ink. The ossuary appeared, the auxiliary corridors, and below them, marked with symbols I didn't recognize, were spaces labeled only as conversion chambers. Someone was feeding me information. Someone wanted me to understand. I should have destroyed the chart immediately, should have burned my hidden ledger and returned to simple, documented work, should have adopted Mara's philosophy of scribing what I was told to scribe and questioning nothing beyond official protocol. Instead, I began planning how to access the lower decks. The opportunity came during the third week following Hendrik's disappearance. A pressure fault developed in one of the environmental systems, triggering automated alerts throughout the administrative section. Standard protocol required all non-essential personnel to remain in designated safe zones while maintenance crews addressed the issue. But in the chaos of evacuation and system checks, I slipped away from my assigned gathering point and made my way toward the spiral stair that led to the ossuary. The descent felt longer than I remembered, the air growing colder with each step. The walls changed as I moved deeper from the painted metal of the upper decks to bare alloy, then to something older, darker, almost organic in its texture. My hand luminator provided the only light, its beam revealing surfaces that seemed to absorb rather than reflect its illumination. The ossuary remained as I'd seen it before, skulls in their niches, names carved in unknowable scripts. But now I had the chart, and it showed passages beyond the ossuary chamber, leading deeper into the ship's hidden geography. I found the door. Yelena must have used a narrow opening behind one of the skull-filled walls, barely visible in the luminator's glow. It opened without resistance, revealing a corridor that descended at a sharp angle. The floor textured with grip patterns that suggested heavy traffic despite the absence of any visible footprints. I descended. The air tasted different here, not the recycled atmosphere of the upper decks, but something rawer, almost wet, carrying flavors of rust and copper, and something biological I couldn't identify. The walls bore markings I recognized from my administratum training, engineering notations, structural load ratings, maintenance schedules, but they'd been carved over, modified, with symbols that belonged to no Imperial standard I knew. The corridor branched. According to the chart, the left passage led to what were labeled as processing stations. The right led to the conversion chambers. I chose left, driven by some instinct that suggested incremental revelation would be more survivable than immediate confrontation with whatever transformation those conversion chambers contained. The processing station resembled a scaled-down version of the verification chambers, where I conducted prisoner identity confirmations. The same basic layout, metal walls, verification equipment, stations for guards and administrators. But the reflective surfaces here showed something different. They displayed not the current state of the room, but images from the past, or perhaps the future. I saw prisoners standing where none currently stood, guards moving through positions they didn't occupy, documentation being processed by hands that left no shadow. A logbook sat on one of the stations, its pages filled with entries in the same handwriting that had modified my hidden ledger. I began reading, and the pattern finally became clear. The Eternal Clemency wasn't simply a prison transport. It was a conversion facility, processing prisoners through stages of documentation and de-documentation. First stage, official entry into Imperial records, full identity verification, complete paper trail. Second stage, selection of candidates for auxiliary service, marked by the loss of reflection as some fundamental quality was stripped away. Third stage, transfer to undocumented status, removal from official manifests while physical presence continued. Fourth stage, conversion into permanent ship's systems, not servitor conversion, which would require documentation, but something older, more fundamental. Integration into the vessel itself. The logbook included efficiency metrics. Of every 100 prisoners officially transported to penal colonies, approximately 30 underwent auxiliary conversion. Of those 30, roughly 20 would be fully integrated into ship systems within 6 months. The remaining 10 served as mobile maintenance units, like Hendrik, performing functions that bridged documented and undocumented spaces. The system had operated for centuries, different names, different official purposes, but always the same underlying machinery. The skulls in the ossuary represented just one cycle of the pattern, some previous era, when the ship had served different masters but required the same fuel. I thought of prisoner 67,234F, marked as deceased in official records, while serving some auxiliary function I couldn't name. I thought of the hundreds of others I'd documented over my months aboard, their reflections absent, their official existence terminated while their physical forms continued. I'd been maintaining the surface documentation while the real work occurred in these lower decks, in spaces between official functions. A sound behind me made me turn. Confessor Yelena stood in the corridor entrance, her unscarred reflection visible in the processing station's strange walls. "You've come further than most," she observed. "Hendrik made it this far, tried to document what he found, tried to file proper reports through official channels, and you had him converted. Not I. The ship chooses. I'm merely a functionary, same as you. The difference is, I understood my function years ago, while you're still struggling with the revelation." She moved into the processing station, her reflection continuing to show her younger, unscarred face. "The Imperium requires vast machinery to function. Transportation networks, communication systems, bureaucratic infrastructure, and that machinery requires fuel. Sometimes that fuel is properly documented: promethium for engines, rations for crews, servitors for maintenance. But sometimes the machinery requires fuel that cannot be officially acknowledged." "Why?" I demanded. "Why maintain the deception? Why not simply convert prisoners openly, through proper channels? The Imperium performs mass servitor conversion. It's documented. Legal. Why this elaborate system of de-documentation?" Yelena smiled, and her reflection smiled with different lips. "Because servitor conversion requires mechanicus oversight, requires specific facilities, specific authorizations, specific documentation. The demand vastly exceeds the supply. Every hive city, every void station, every military installation requires servitors, but the mechanicus can only produce so many through official channels. So the Imperium developed alternative systems, ships like this, facilities that operate between documented spaces. We provide the necessary fuel without burdening the official infrastructure." "We're criminals," I said. "We're violating Imperial law. We're serving Imperial function. Law and function aren't always aligned. You know this. You've read enough administratum regulations to understand that official procedure often contradicts operational reality. Your job was to maintain the surface documentation, to ensure the prisoner transport appeared to function according to standard protocols. The ship's job was to extract maximum utility from its cargo. Both functions serve the Imperium. Both are necessary." I thought of my months of careful record-keeping, my meticulous death certificates and manifest updates, my pride in maintaining accurate documentation, all of its surface performance, theater staged for administratum auditors and oversight committees. The real work had been happening beneath my notice, in spaces I wasn't authorized to see, processing prisoners through conversion systems that served unstated Imperial needs. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now that I know?" "That depends on you," Yelena said. "You can return to your duties, maintain your documentation with the understanding that you're serving a larger function than you initially realized. Many scribes choose this path once they achieve clarity. They continue their work with improved efficiency, knowing how their surface documentation enables the underlying conversion processes. And the alternative? You can refuse, can attempt to file reports through official channels, as Hendrik tried, can appeal to higher authorities, demand investigations, insist on adherence to documented procedures." Her reflection showed a younger woman shaking her head sadly. "But consider what that means. You'd be reporting that a prisoner transport vessel is performing unauthorized conversions. That would require investigation. Ships would be dispatched. Inspectors would board. And what would they find?" She gestured around the processing station, at the walls showing their strange temporal reflections. "They'd find a properly functioning prison transport with complete documentation, all manifests balanced, all death certificates properly filed, all prisoners accounted for according to official records. Your reports would appear to be the paranoid delusions of an unstable scribe, and you'd be removed from service for psychological evaluation. You'd become another discrepancy to be resolved, another number that doesn't balance, another candidate for auxiliary conversion." I understood then why she'd shown me the ossuary, why she'd allowed me to descend to the processing stations. Not to threaten me, but to educate me, to demonstrate the futility of resistance, the impossibility of reporting what I'd discovered through any official channel that would take action. "How many ships operate like this?" I asked. "Enough. Scattered throughout the Imperium's transportation networks. Prison transports primarily, but also pilgrim vessels, refugee carriers, labor conveyances, any large-scale human transport with sufficient volume to mask discrepancies in passenger counts. We're a distributed system, unofficial but essential, providing services the Imperium requires, but cannot officially acknowledge. And you've made peace with this? With being part of this machinery? Her scarred face showed something that might have been compassion. I've made peace with my function. I serve as confessor to a congregation that doesn't officially exist. I provide spiritual comfort to those undergoing conversion. I maintain the ossuary and honor the names of those who've served before. Is it the role I imagined when I took my orders? No. But it's the role I've been given, and I perform it as faithfully as I can. She turned to leave, then paused. You have a choice to make, scribe. The same choice Hendrik faced. You can continue your work with new understanding, or you can refuse and face the consequences. But know this, the ship is already familiar with your pattern. It's been watching since the first day you noticed the reflectionless prisoners. It's been feeding you information, testing whether you'd integrate that knowledge productively, or whether you'd require conversion to continue serving. Testing me? The chart you found, the additions to your hidden ledger. You think those appeared by accident? The ship has systems, both mechanical and human, that identify potential auxiliary candidates. You're being evaluated, scribe. Your actions over the next few days will determine whether you remain in documentation or transfer to different service. She departed, leaving me alone in the processing station with its temporal walls and their unsettling reflections. I remained there for perhaps an hour, reading through the logbooks, examining the equipment, trying to understand the conversion process in technical detail. The mechanics were surprisingly mundane. No dark rituals, no warp corruption, no heretical technology, simply systematic suppression of certain cognitive functions, behavioral conditioning toward mechanical efficiency, gradual integration of the subject into ship's systems through a combination of chemical treatment and neural programming. The process took weeks, involved multiple stages, and resulted in what the documentation clinically described as optimized auxiliary units. Hendrik hadn't been tortured or corrupted. He'd been optimized, stripped of those elements of personality and independent thought that interfered with efficient performance of maintenance duties. His reflection had vanished because some fundamental quality of individual identity had been suppressed, leaving only the functional shell that performed assigned tasks. I could walk that same path. Continue asking questions, continue investigating, continue documenting what I found in my hidden ledgers until the ship determined I required conversion to continue serving. Or I could return to my station, maintain my surface documentation, accept my role in the larger machinery. Or there was a third option, one Yelena hadn't mentioned. I could refuse to serve at all. I made my way back through the corridors, ascending past the ossuary, climbing the spiral stair toward the administrative decks. The pressure fault had been resolved during my absence, and crew had returned to normal duties. I slipped back into my quarters without being noticed, stored my hidden ledger in its locked compartment, and reported to my station for the evening shift. Caius looked up when I arrived. You were absent during the evacuation muster. I remained in archives, I lied smoothly, securing sensitive documentation per protocol. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded and returned to his manifests. But I saw him watching me throughout the shift. I noticed the way his eyes tracked my movements, observed how he documented my actions in some personal log I couldn't see. The verification session that evening included 20 prisoners. 15 showed proper reflections. 5 did not. I processed them all according to standard protocol, confirming identities, checking manifests, recording the appropriate notations. One of the reflectionless prisoners, a young man with burn scars covering his arms, met my eyes as I verified his number. "Do you see it?" he whispered, too quietly for the guards to hear. "Do you see what we become?" I looked at the wall behind him, at the empty space where his reflection should have appeared. "I see," I answered. "Then you know what comes next. For me, for you, for all of us who notice." His voice carried neither fear nor acceptance, just weary recognition. The ship is always hungry. The guard pulled him away before I could respond, and I completed the evening's documentation without further incident, but his words followed me back to my quarters, repeated in my thoughts as I stared at my own reflection in my personal mirror. I looked solid, real, undeniably present. But for how much longer? How many more shifts before I processed a verification session and found my own reflection absent? How many more entries in my hidden ledger before the ship decided I'd gathered enough prohibited knowledge to require conversion? I opened my storage compartment and retrieved the hidden documentation. Dozens of pages now, filled with prisoner numbers and observation notes and patterns I'd identified. Proof of my investigation. Evidence of my growing understanding. I should have burned it. Should have destroyed every trace of my prohibited documentation and returned to simple, unquestioning service. Instead, I began writing. Not the careful, precise notation of administratum work, but something more personal. A confession, perhaps, or a warning. A record of what I'd discovered for whoever might find it after I was gone, after my reflection vanished and my official documentation marked me deceased or transferred. I wrote through the night shift, through the morning muster, through the hours when I should have been sleeping. I documented everything: the reflectionless prisoners, the ossuary, the processing stations, the conversion chambers I hadn't yet entered, Confessor Yelena's explanations, Hendrik's transformation, the ship's true purpose operating beneath its official function. And as I wrote, I felt something shift. Not physically, not yet. But in the mirror across from my desk, my reflection began to seem less certain, less solid. The edges blurred, the details softened, as though the act of documenting these truths was itself sufficient to begin the process of de-documentation. By the time I finished writing, the morning shift had begun. I sealed my confession in an envelope addressed to no one, stored it in my locked compartment alongside my hidden ledger, and reported to my station. Mara was waiting. "You look tired," she observed. "More tired than someone should look after a rest period." "I've been documenting," I said. "Ah." She returned to her manifests, but her tone carried warning. "Be careful what you document, scribe. Some records are better left unmaintained." The day proceeded according to normal routine. Morning verifications, death certificate processing, manifest updates. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, my hands moving through familiar motions while my mind wandered through the corridors I'd explored, through the revelations I'd documented. During the midday ration period, I made my decision. I would neither accept my role as conscious participant in the conversion machinery, nor wait passively for the ship to convert me into auxiliary service. I would document everything I'd learned and ensure that documentation reached someone beyond the time's eternal clemency's time systems. Not through official channels. Yelena had demonstrated the futility of that approach, but through other means. The ship would dock at Gehenna Tertius in 4 weeks to deliver its official cargo of prisoners. During those brief hours of port connection, there would be opportunity to transfer unauthorized information to someone outside the vessel's closed system. A dock worker, a port official, anyone who might carry my documentation to authorities with power to investigate ships that operated between documented spaces. It was a thin hope, but it was action rather than acceptance, resistance rather than complicity. I returned to my station for the afternoon shift and immediately noticed the change. My desk had been relocated. Not far, just 3 positions to the left, placing me directly in front of one of the archive's large reflective walls. The change hadn't been noted in any official communication. My files and equipment had simply been moved during the midday period, and I was expected to adapt without question. I sat at my new station and looked at the wall before me. My reflection stared back, still present, still solid, but I understood the message. The ship was positioning me where I could monitor my own status, where I could watch as my reflection gradually faded, where the conversion process would be visible to me as it progressed. Caius worked 2 stations to my right now, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me and then toward that reflective wall, watching, documenting. reporting my status to whatever systems or persons had determined I required closer observation. I began the afternoon's verification session. 10 prisoners, 7 with reflections, 3 without. But this time, when I looked at the reflectionless ones and then checked my own image in the wall, I saw what I'd been dreading. The edges of my reflection had softened further. Not dramatically, an observer who didn't know to look for it might not notice, but I could see the subtle blurring, the slight uncertainty in the boundary between my reflected form and the wall behind it. The process had begun. I had perhaps days, maybe weeks before the conversion reached the point where I'd be officially transferred to auxiliary service, time enough to continue my documentation, time enough to plan how I might deliver it beyond the ship's systems. But the deadline was no longer theoretical. I could watch it approaching in my gradual disappearance from reflective surfaces. That evening, I returned to the lower decks. Not to investigate further, I'd learned enough about the processing stations, but to visit the ossuary, to stand among the skulls and their unreadable names, to understand what awaited those of us who became absorbed into the ship's machinery. Confessor Yelena was there, conducting some kind of ritual before the niches. She didn't turn when I entered, but her voice carried clearly in the chamber's acoustics. "You've chosen the difficult path," she said. "Resistance rather than acceptance. You knew I would. I hoped you might. The ship needs efficient auxiliaries, but it also needs those who remember what efficiency costs, those who carry the knowledge of what we truly are." She turned to face me, and in the ossuary's dim light, her reflection and her physical form seemed to align more closely, the scars on both faces matching in their placement. "There are others like you, scattered throughout the Imperium's unofficial systems, maintaining documentation of what we do, bearing witness to the machinery that operates beneath official functions. To what purpose? If no one outside these systems can receive the documentation, if reporting through official channels only results in our own conversion, what's the point of maintaining these records? Because someone must remember," she said simply. "Someone must know that the individuals who enter these systems were people, not just numbers. That the names we carve into these skulls represent lives that mattered beyond their utility to Imperial machinery. You think your confession will change anything if it reaches port authorities? You think investigation would result in anything but the ship being certified as properly functioning according to undocumented but authorized protocols? Then why encourage me to document at all? Because the act of documentation itself is resistance. Because maintaining the record, even if no one reads it, preserves something the conversion process tries to erase. Identity, memory, the knowledge that we were human before we became auxiliary functions." She gestured at the skulls. These names weren't meant to be readable. They were carved in languages that died millennia ago by systems that predated Imperial Gothic as deliberate attempts to preserve identity in forms that outlasted the official documentation. You think you're the first scribe to document what you've discovered? The first to attempt to maintain records of the conversion process? She led me to a specific niche, reaching into it to withdraw a bundle of parchment wrapped in preservative cloth. Inside were pages identical to my own hidden documentation, prisoner numbers, observation notes, patterns identified, confessions written in first-person accounts of gradual conversion. Every scribe who serves long enough aboard ships like this one eventually notices the discrepancies, Yelena explained. The reflectionless prisoners, the resource consumption that doesn't match official population, the death certificates that don't align with physical observation. And many of them, like you, choose to document what they discover. Their records join the others in the ossuary, preserved but unread, maintained but ineffectual, testaments to the human need to record our own erasure. I stared at the bundle, hundreds of pages, maybe thousands, from scribes who'd preceded me, all documenting the same patterns I'd identified, all bearing witness to the same conversion machinery, all ultimately absorbed into the system they'd attempted to document. So my confession is meaningless. My documentation changes nothing. I'll be converted regardless, and my records will join these others, as historical curiosities for future scribes to discover before they undergo the same process. Perhaps, Yelena said, or perhaps one scribe's documentation will reach someone who can act on it. Perhaps the accumulated weight of all these testimonies serves purposes we cannot perceive. Or perhaps the value lies not in external effect, but in internal preservation, in maintaining your humanity through the act of witnessing, even as that humanity is systematically stripped away. She returned the bundle to its niche, placing it carefully among the skulls. You have time yet before conversion completes. Use it as you choose. Document further if you wish. Attempt to smuggle your confession off ship when we reach port. Or accept your transformation and serve with the understanding that you bore witness for as long as you were able. All paths lead to the same destination. Only the journey differs. I left the ossuary with more questions than I'd arrived with, but one certainty had crystallized. I would continue documenting, not because I believed it would result in investigation or change, but because Yelena was right. The act of maintaining the record was itself resistance. As long as I could still observe, still analyze, still write, I remained something more than an auxiliary function. The following days fell into new rhythms. I maintained my official duties without error, processing verifications and death certificates with the precision the administratum required. But my evenings and night shifts were devoted to expanded documentation. I recorded everything I could observe about the conversion process, both from watching other subjects transform and from monitoring my own gradual de-documentation. My reflection continued its slow fade. Each morning I could see the difference, a little less solid, a little less present, the wall behind me showing through with increasing clarity. Caius documented my changes in whatever private log he maintained. Mara offered no comment, but occasionally looked at me with what might have been pity. Petra, the new scribe who'd taken Hendrik's station, avoided looking at me at all. I saw Hendrik twice more during those weeks. Once, in a deep maintenance corridor, adjusting atmospheric controls with the same mechanical precision I'd observed before. Once in the cargo hold during a routine inventory, moving containers with strength that suggested chemical enhancement. Both times his reflection remained absent. Both times he showed no recognition when I addressed him. The conversion process stripped identity incrementally. First, the reflection vanished, that fundamental recognition of self as separate from environment. Then personal connections dissolved, family memories, individual relationships, the web of associations that defined one's place in social structures. Then cognitive complexity reduced abstract thought, giving way to procedural thinking. Philosophical questions replaced by task-focused processing. Finally, physical autonomy, modified strength increased for labor. Sensory acuity narrowed to task-relevant parameters. Biological needs minimized to reduce maintenance requirements. What remained was functional, efficient, optimized for service, but no longer entirely human. I documented each stage as I observed it in others, and felt hints of it beginning in myself. The memories of my family on my homeworld had started feeling distant, more like stories I'd been told than experiences I'd lived. The philosophical questions that had troubled me during early weeks aboard the Time's eternal clemency, Time's questions about the morality of the prison system, the justice of imperial law, the purpose of my documentation no longer generated the emotional responses they once had. I was being optimized. Slowly, but unmistakably. 3 weeks before port arrival, I made my final descent to the lower decks, not to the processing stations this time, but to the conversion chambers the chart had marked, but I'd never entered. The chambers were larger than I'd anticipated, each one capable of processing dozens of subjects simultaneously. The equipment resembled Medicae facilities, but with modifications I couldn't identify: neural interface stations, chemical delivery systems, behavioral conditioning apparatus. Documentation on the walls indicated processing stages, timeline expectations, success rate metrics. Current occupants numbered approximately 40, all in various stages of conversion. Some still retained enough cognitive function to track my entrance with their eyes. Others had progressed further, their attention locked on assigned tasks or on nothing at all. Their reflections were universally absent. I recognized prisoner 67,234F, the first reflectionless woman I'd documented. She sat at a neural interface station, her hands moving through some kind of pattern exercise, her expression blank. According to the chart above her station, she was in stage 4 of 7 behavioral conditioning complete, cognitive simplification in progress, physical optimization pending. "They still feel pain," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a technician I didn't recognize, a man wearing maintenance coveralls with modifications suggesting mechanicus training, though his augmentation level was far below that of a proper tech priest. "The conversion process requires consciousness," he continued, approaching one of the neural interface stations to check readouts. "We suppress certain cognitive functions while enhancing others, but awareness persists throughout. They experience the transformation. They understand what they're becoming. The knowledge simply doesn't generate the emotional response it once would have. No fear, no resistance, just observation." "Why are you telling me this?" He smiled, the expression not quite reaching his augmented eyes. "Because you're documenting. Because you're trying to understand. Because in approximately 12 days, you'll occupy one of these stations, and I thought you might prefer to enter the process with clarity rather than confusion." 12 days? That's our current projection based on your reflection degradation rate. You're progressing faster than average cognitive resistance actually accelerates the conversion process. Those who fight their transformation complete the initial stages more quickly than those who accept. Ironic, really. I looked at the chamber's occupants, at their blank expressions and absent reflections, at the apparatus that would soon process my own transformation. And after conversion, what happens when the ship reaches port and delivers its official cargo? Do the auxiliaries transfer to new vessels, return to dock facilities? Some transfer, yes, but most remain with their source vessel. The Times, Eternal Clemency Times, has been building its auxiliary complement for decades. We're nearly at optimal staffing levels, enough auxiliaries to maintain all systems without requiring external service support. Once we reach full complement, the ship will become entirely self-sufficient. No more reliance on port facilities for maintenance. No more dependency on external labor. A ship that crews itself with prisoners it's converted. A ship that serves itself using optimized auxiliary units derived from prisoner stock, yes. The Imperium has hundreds of such vessels operating throughout the transportation networks. Self-maintaining, self-sufficient, requiring minimal external oversight. Efficient. He made an adjustment to prisoner 67,234F's neural interface. She didn't react, her hands continuing their pattern exercises without interruption. "You'll make a good auxiliary, scribe. Your documentation skills will be preserved and repurposed. We need units capable of maintaining internal records, logging system status, documenting conversion processes. You'll serve that function. Your ability to witness and record will continue, just directed toward more productive purposes than your current resistance." I thought of the hundreds of pages I'd written, the confession I'd sealed away, the plan to smuggle documentation off ship during port connection. All of it would be irrelevant once conversion completed. I'd still be capable of documentation, but I'd document what the ship required rather than what my conscience demanded. "Will I remember this conversation?" I asked. "Perhaps." Memory suppression is selective, targeting primarily emotional associations and philosophical frameworks. Factual recall often persists. You might remember standing here, remember our discussion, remember understanding what awaited you. You simply won't care anymore. I left the conversion chambers and returned to my quarters. 12 days remained before the projected start of my formal processing. 12 days to complete my documentation, to finalize my confession, to attempt whatever futile gesture of resistance I'd planned. I worked continuously over those days, rarely sleeping, abandoning any pretense of normal routine. My official duties suffered. I filed incomplete manifests, processed verifications hastily, made errors in death certificate documentation. Caius reported each failure. The ship's administrative systems noted my declining performance, but they didn't intervene. They simply watched as I devoted my remaining functional time to private documentation rather than assigned duties. The confession grew to enormous length, hundreds of pages detailing everything I'd observed, everyone I'd seen converted, every pattern I'd identified in the ship's operations. I documented the processing stations, the conversion chambers, the ossuary full of previous witnesses. I transcribed segments from the other scribes' confessions I'd found among the skulls. I created a comprehensive record of the time's eternal clemency's time's true nature. And as I wrote, my reflection continued its fade. By day 8, I was barely visible in reflective surfaces, just a vague outline, a suggestion of presence rather than solid form. By day 10, I disappeared entirely from mirrors and polished walls. When I looked at reflective surfaces, I saw only the room behind me, the furniture and fixtures, the walls and ceiling. No trace of my physical form remained in those secondary images. But unlike the prisoners I'd observed, unlike Hendrik when his reflection had vanished, I retained full cognitive function. The awareness of my absent reflection generated profound discomfort, a wrongness that persisted despite the emotional suppression that should have begun by this stage. I was progressing abnormally, resistant to conversion in ways the technician hadn't anticipated. On day 11, Confessor Yelena came to my quarters. She found me at my desk, writing the final sections of my confession, my solid physical form casting no reflection in the mirror behind me. "You're fighting the process," she observed, "maintaining cognitive complexity through sheer documentation effort. It's remarkable and futile, maybe. But I'm still here, still thinking, still remembering who I was. For a few more hours, the ship's systems have noted your resistance. They've scheduled your formal processing for tomorrow morning, forced conversion, since the gradual approach has proven insufficient." I sealed the final pages of my confession, adding them to the thick bundle I'd accumulated. I'd planned to smuggle this off-ship during port connection, to find someone in dock facilities who could deliver it to authorities capable of investigating. "That was never realistic," Yelena said gently. "Port connection is minimal automated cargo transfer, no personnel exchange, all communication via encrypted administratum channels. You'd have no opportunity to contact anyone outside the ship's systems. So all of this," I gestured at the confession, "was pointless. Not pointless. Necessary for you. You needed to bear witness, to maintain your documentation until the very end. That impulse is what made you human. Losing it would mean the conversion had already succeeded." She reached for the confession bundle. "May I?" I handed it to her. She paged through the sections, reading passages I'd written during my last functional nights. "This is good work," she said finally. "Comprehensive, honest, a worthy addition to the collection." She noticed my confusion. "The ossuary, scribe, your confession will join the others, preserved with the skulls and the names, maintained as testimony that someone witnessed, someone remembered, someone refused to simply accept their optimization. So it ends with my conversion, my transformation into an auxiliary unit, my consciousness stripped down to whatever functional minimum the ship requires. Most likely, yes, though you've resisted more effectively than most. The forced processing tomorrow will probably succeed, but there's a small chance your cognitive resistance might prove incompatible with standard conversion protocols. In which case," she trailed off, leaving the alternative unstated. "In which case what?" "In which case the ship will determine you're unsuitable for auxiliary service. You'll be marked for alternative processing, which means actual death, scribe. Not the half-death of conversion but complete cessation, your body recycled for biological components. Your number added to the death manifests as genuine deceased rather than transferred to auxiliary service." The prospect should have terrified me, should have triggered survival instinct, should have made me reconsider my resistance, should have motivated me to accept conversion as the preferable alternative to actual mortality. But I felt only relief. If I couldn't remain human, couldn't maintain my full cognitive function and emotional capacity and individual identity, then non-existence seemed cleaner than optimized service. "I'm ready," I told Yelena, "for whichever outcome tomorrow brings." She took my confession bundle and departed, leaving me alone in my quarters with my absent reflection and my complete documentation. I spent that final night organizing my materials, ensuring every page was properly ordered, every observation clearly noted. Not because I believed anyone would read it or act upon it, but because the act of organization itself was human, was purposeful, was evidence that some part of me remained resistant to optimization. Morning came. Guards arrived at my quarters, not the standard prison transport guards, but specialized units whose augmentation suggested mechanicus training. They escorted me through corridors I'd never traveled, down to levels below even the conversion chambers, into sections of the ship that predated its current function. The processing facility they brought me to resembled both Medicae chambers and mechanicus workshops, equipped with apparatus for neural modification, chemical treatment, behavioral conditioning, and physical optimization. 20 stations filled the space, most occupied by subjects in various stages of forced conversion. Their screams had been suppressed, some mechanical intervention preventing vocal output, but their eyes showed awareness, showed understanding, showed the conscious experience of their own transformation. The technician from my previous visit waited at an empty station. Subject 19, arriving for processing. He announced to whatever systems monitored the facility. Scribe designation, administrative function, demonstrating abnormal resistance to gradual conversion protocols. Recommend forced processing at intensity level 7. They secured me to the station, neural interfaces connecting to ports I hadn't known existed in my skull, chemical delivery systems inserting needles into my arms and spine. The apparatus hummed to life, and I felt the first stages of forced conversion begin. The pain was extraordinary. Not physical pain, though there was certainly that the neural interfaces burned where they connected, the chemicals seared through my veins, my muscles convulsed against the restraints. But worse was the cognitive pain, the sensation of my mind being systematically dismantled, sorted, optimized for efficient function rather than complex thought. I felt memories dissolving, my childhood on my homeworld gone, my training at the Schola Administratum simplified to procedural knowledge without emotional context, my relationships with colleagues reduced to functional recognition without personal connection. The philosophical frameworks that had shaped my understanding of the Imperium stripped away entirely, but my capacity for observation persisted. Even as other cognitive functions degraded, my ability to witness remained intact. I could observe my own conversion with terrible clarity, could document mentally what was happening even as I lost the language to articulate it properly. The technician monitored readouts, making adjustments to the conversion parameters. His expression shifted from confident to concerned as the process continued. Subject showing persistent cognitive resistance, he reported. Core observation functions refusing optimization, attempting deeper neural modification. The intensity increased. The pain transcended description. I felt my sense of self fracturing, felt individual identity dissolving into component functions. What remained was awareness without personality, observation without interpretation, consciousness stripped of everything that made it distinctly mine. And then something broke. Not my resistance, the conversion apparatus itself. Alerts sounded throughout the facility. The neural interfaces sparked and died. The chemical delivery systems shut down emergency protocols. The restraints released. I collapsed from the station, my body convulsing, my mind fragmenting into pieces that couldn't quite reassemble into coherent whole. The technician called for assistance, medical units responding to the equipment failure. But as I lay on that cold metal floor, unable to move or speak or process what had happened, I understood. My resistance hadn't prevented conversion. It had made me incompatible with it. The apparatus designed to optimize human cognition for auxiliary service couldn't process a mind that had documented its own transformation with such persistent clarity. My observation function had become so deeply embedded in my cognitive structure that removing it would require complete neural dissolution. I'd documented myself into unsuitable for conversion. Yelena appeared among the medical units, her scarred face showing no surprise. Alternative processing, she instructed. Subject unsuitable for auxiliary service. Mark for biological recycling. They moved me to a different chamber, simpler than the conversion facility, equipped with apparatus I recognized from administratum documentation. Corpse processing. Biological component extraction. The machinery used to reduce deceased prisoners to useful materials, proteins for nutrient paste, minerals for industrial applications, organic compounds for chemical synthesis. I would be truly dead within hours. Not converted, not optimized, but completely ceased. My body recycled into ship's systems in the most literal sense. My consciousness ended rather than reduced. As they secured me to the processing apparatus, Yelena leaned close. "Your confession is preserved," she whispered. "In the ossuary with the others, your witnessing persists even as you don't. That matters, scribe. Perhaps not to the Imperium, perhaps not to anyone who'll ever read it. But it matters because someone maintained the documentation, someone refused to stop observing." The apparatus activated. I felt my consciousness beginning to dissolve for the final time, not into optimized service but into simple non-existence. My last thought was of my confession, those hundreds of pages sealed among the skulls, bearing witness to what I'd seen aboard the Eternal Clemency. And then I felt nothing at all. But my documentation persists. In the ossuary, among the names carved in forgotten languages and the confessions written by scribes who preceded me, waiting for the next administrative functionary who notices discrepancies, who questions what reflections show, who chooses to document rather than accept. The ship continues its function, processing prisoners through official and unofficial systems, maintaining the surface documentation while converting suitable subjects into auxiliary service. The Imperium continues to require vast machinery to sustain itself, and that machinery continues to require fuel that cannot be officially acknowledged. I am gone, but my witnessing remains. Someone had to document what we become. Someone had to remember we were human first.